I just want to say a word about the occasion for our speaker coming to Penn. The talk today is sponsored by the Joseph Alexander, it's not sponsored by, it is the Joseph Alexander Colloquium, which is Penn's oldest endowed lecture in Jewish studies. The Joseph Alexander Colloquium is supported through the generosity of the Joseph Alexander Foundation and the Mackler family. And today marks the 31st annual Joseph Alexander Colloquium. We have quite an amazing list of former speakers in this venue: Moshe Greenberg, Ruth Weiss, Nahum Sarna, Leon Wieseltier, Elisheva Baumgarten, David Engel, and Sam Kazow, and many, many others over the past 31 years. Before I introduce our introducer, I just want to say a personal word about Walter Zev Feldman, our speaker today. I first met Walter, or Zev, I think I knew you as Walter in Williams Hall, but you're Zev in the Yiddish world, I think, when he was teaching Turkish language at Penn in the department of what was then called Oriental Studies, and then later became known as AIMS, Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and today is called NELC, Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He was teaching here starting in 1986 through 1998, and that was around the time I started teaching Yiddish language here in Germanic languages and literatures. Walter Zev taught Turkish literature and music, and I remember him once coming to my intermediate Yiddish class and teaching them about the origins of klezmer. And I also have to say that in my office in Williams Hall, I have a poster on the wall, an early klezmer poster that features you. It's wonderful. So you're with me every day at Penn. So I'm not actually going to introduce Zev, but I'm going to introduce our introducer, who is Golan Gur, who is a fellow at the Katz Center this year, and very kindly accepted my invitation to come. He was previously a Newton International Fellow in the Faculty of Music at the University of Cambridge and specializes in music aesthetics, the social history of music, and has a particular emphasis on the 19th and 20th century German and German-Jewish musical culture. He's a native speaker of Hebrew and has additional expertise in Jewish ethnomusicology and Israeli art and popular music. I'm not going to go into all of his publications and works, but I'm going to give him the podium and let him introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a pleasure and an honor to present Walter Zev Feldman. Professor Feldman is a leading researcher in Jewish music and Ottoman musical culture. As a matter of fact, we just discovered that I attended one of his lectures maybe 13, 14 years ago about Turkish music at Tel Aviv University when I was still a young student doing his first steps in musicology. But Professor Feldman is also an authority on Eastern European Jewish dance. It is a research area that is currently exploring as part of a project on the role of gesture in the performing arts. Currently a visiting professor of music at NYU Abu Dhabi, he is also the director of the Ansky Institute for Jewish Expressive Culture and board member of the Corpus Musicae Ottomanicae at the University of Münster, Germany. Outside academia, Feldman is a performer on the traditional klezmer dulmitzer, the cymbal, and on the Ottoman lute, the tanbur. Since the 70s, he played a central role in the revival of klezmer music. He has performed internationally and with his group Chevrisa, as well as with the Alexander Fitterstein Trio. His newly published book, Klezmer Music, History and Memory, explores the history of Jewish klezmer music in Eastern Europe from its emergence in the 16th century and until the early 20th century. The book takes a historical and ethnomusicological approach, combining a broad range of methods: style analysis, oral history, and the study of sources. In tracing the history of klezmer music, explored the late Tsaric and early Soviet periods, as well as rare cantorial klezmer manuscripts. One of the most striking aspects of Feldman's study is the emphasis on the embeddedness of klezmer music in the social history of Eastern European Jews. Although klezmer musicians were professionals, klezmer music was not, or not only, a musical genre to be enjoyed on its own right, at least not during the period under question. Rather, it was an integral part of social life, and as such, an expression of both religious and ethnic national elements of Jewish and local transnational identities. Furthermore, drawing on recent interdisciplinary theories of gesture, Feldman advances the claim that the popular topos of the speaking instruments, or the language character associated with klezmer music, should be taken seriously, being a key parameter in understanding the nature of klezmer music and its relation to other aspects of Eastern European Jewish culture. The connection with verbal and bodily forms of expression establishes the function of klezmer music as an expression of nonverbal communal memory. I am delighted to welcome Professor Feldman.
I'll see if this works, if it can. I'll be doing a little dancing at the end, but before I do that, I think I have to rest my weary bones after coming in from New York. Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah? Thank you. The introduction was, I'm glad that you put the emphasis on gesture, because in my latter work, say in the past 6-7 years, I've come to see how crucial that is, and I'll get back to that shortly. I'm glad to be speaking again here at Penn, after many years' absence. Also, Philadelphia and Penn have a very particular importance in the history of the study of Jewish music and dance that some of you may or may not know. I'll refer to, first of all, Hank Snetsky's recent publication of Temple, which is Klezmer, Music and Community in 20th Century Philadelphia, which is based on his dissertation from 2004 at Wesleyan University, under Mark Slobin. And Mark Slobin, back in 1982, published here at UPenn Press, he published Old Jewish Folk Music, the collection and writings of Moshe Beregovsky, who was the key figure in documenting klezmer music. That without him, I would have no book, and there would be no possible study. In fact, even the name klezmer music comes from his klezmerische Musik. He had two terms, klezmerische Volksmusik, klezmerische Musik. Before Beregovsky, there was no way to define the music. All the early scholarship on the wedding music or Jewish orchestras, which, by the way, begins in the Russian Empire. Without the Russian research, again, we would have no subject. And I should just add that I blundered into these sources when I was a mere grad student. And fortunately, I could read both Russian and Yiddish and Hebrew. So I came across the earliest article written about the klezmer music, as we understand it now, which was Yevreysky Orchestri, the Jewish orchestras, published in Petersburg in 1904 by the non-Jewish musician Ivan Lepaev. You see, and only in Russia you had this high-level collaboration of musicologists, composers, and students, performers that only occurred in the Russian Empire, in the Russian-speaking part of the Russian Empire. So, but the term klezmer music wasn't yet coined until Moshe Beregovsky created klezmerische Musik. And actually, I've learned that I seem to have created the English term, klezmer music. Both Barbara Kirschenblatt, who was teaching here long ago, that's now at NYU, now in Warsaw, of course, at the Jewish Museum, and Michael Alpert pointed out to me that way back in the 70s, I was talking about klezmer music. Nobody knew what I was talking about. But I'd read Beregovsky, and I thought, what's the best form to use? Well, klezmer music in English. And so the concert that Catherine referred to from 1978, which was through the National Endowment for the Arts, we put on Dave Taras, my teacher, we called it Jewish klezmer music. And the next year, the recording I did with Andy Statman, we were both Dave Taras' students, was called Jewish klezmer music. And we had to put the word Jewish, because we thought, who would understand what klezmer music is? It's expecting too much. So we had Jewish klezmer music. And to my great surprise, this term caught on. And now it's used in many languages, including German, where it's a borrowing from English. Their Klezmer is our, Klezmer music. In any case, the third light of the exile is the dance research that was done here at UPenn in the folklore department in the 80s by Lee Ellen Friedland. Are we familiar with Lee Ellen Friedland? Her work, unfortunately she never finished her dissertation, but she wrote the most, perceptive writing about Jewish dance, Ethiopian Jewish dance that has ever been written. And it's, she comes from a family of musicians and dancers in Belarus. She grew up in the Lower East Side. And she has a good dance ethnography background. And she wrote about 5 pages, an article called Tanzen is Leben, which was published in the Dance Journal in 1985. And she has the basic principles of East European Jewish dance right there. At the time in the 80s, she was a lone voice in the wilderness. Honestly, almost nobody understood what she was talking about. So she eventually left the field. I talked to her recently. She's in D.C. and still very interested in the subject. But unfortunately, the writing that she did is only very, very minimal. But that happened here. It happened at UPenn. Okay, so, and of course, as we know, there is a very lively klezmer history in Philadelphia. It's still, as we see, some representatives here. But this also goes back to the beginning of the immigration in the 1880s. So that's nice to be back at Penn. And I'm going to try to do the impossible, which is to summarize 440 pages in a few minutes. And this subject is one that it's hard for me to explain my relationship to it, because it's so integral, going back to my childhood, to the Landsmannschaft background of my father. And indeed, in the last 5 years, thanks to the generosity of New York University, Abu Dhabi, I've been able to go back to our shtetl, to my father's shtetl in northern Bessarabia, which was always, we don't know when it always was, but it was for a long time a center of music. And I'm able to interview a more older generation of Tzigan, the gypsy musicians, who some of them still understand some Yiddish and play Jewish weddings when they were young. And only in that country, not anywhere else in Europe, you had a real symbiosis of the gypsy musicians and the Jewish klezmorim, because of the social conditions that emerged, first of all, in the Ottoman Empire. That's to say, unlike most other East European Jews, we were not Polish Jews, we were Ottoman Jews. So the social conditions were much different and actually much better than for most of Eastern Europe. And in that environment, we had another, let's say, professional group of musicians who were gypsies, who were Tzigan, who were also professionally organized. So in that country, the two groups merged. In fact, in Romanian, they sometimes call themselves klezmer. They say, noi klezmer, we klezmorim, because those towns were predominantly Jewish until the Shoah. So of course, they were playing for a largely Jewish clientele. And what I discovered from my colleagues in Chisinau is that just as we have, in 1994, I published my article in Ethnomusicology, Bulgariaska, Bulgarish, Bulgar, the evolution of a klezmer dance genre, where I show the emergence of the dominant form of Jewish dance music in America, the Bulgar dance, out of a Moldavian dance called Bulgarianska. But now I understand the story is far more complicated than that both the Bulgarish and Bulgariaska emerged in contact with Greek and Turkish dancing in Istanbul, and that also the Moldavians have a corresponding Moldavianized Jewish repertoire that they play at their weddings, which has been going on since sometime in the 19th century. My colleague Vasily Kiselytsa at the Academy of Sciences in Chisinau has been documenting this for the last 30 years. So you have kosher style tunes played for the Gentiles. They're called chusid, and they were played at certain parts of the Christian ritual, not in the church, but at certain parts of the secular ritual, and they have to be chusid. They're called chusid tunes, and they also dance shire, which is of course comes from share, and freilex, which is one of their dances. And so, just as the process that I saw my teacher, Dave Taras, creating Judaized versions of the repertoire, by the way, of Yiddish. He studied in our shtetl before coming to New York, because this was an important place, and I see the link now between Taras's repertoire and the local repertoire of Yiddish. So just as he was creating these Judaized versions of this shared repertoire, the Gypsies were creating Moldavianized versions of the Jewish repertoire for a Gentile conception. Now that's the next book, by the way. This book is going to be called Untold Stories, the klezmer music of Bessarabia and historical Moldova. And there I'll be able to take the story from Moldova to America. I have a justification for doing that. This book here that you see is not about America. It only has one chapter about Moldova. I have had to be discipline myself and just put Moldova aside for another book. I limit my discussion about America because the subject is the klezmer music of Eastern Europe, and which is much more varied and richer than actually what we were able to preserve in America. So I myself have this rather ambivalent relationship because obviously when I was young I heard what was being played in the Bronx, in the late 50s, 60s, and so forth. And my first teacher, Dave Taras, who I met in the mid-70s, he was, of course, a household name for us. Since he studied the Yiddish, he played at the Yiddish Landsmannschaft when he was younger, and UPenn on the radio, of course, in WUPD. When I studied with him, he was the master of the American klezmer repertoire. He composed much of it. But 10 years after Taras passed away, I managed, through Itzik Ottosman, the wonderful Yiddishist who's now in Texas, Itzik introduced me to who may have been the last European-born band leader, Kapellmeister, at the time, who was living in Manhattan, unknown to almost anybody in this world, in the Jewish music world, Yermia Hescheles, who was better known as a journalist, writing in Der Tog, and is a very good Yiddish poet in the introspective style, the In-sich style. But in his youth, he had been a klezmer band leader, the first violin. And so I spent almost a year interviewing him, almost weekly, and playing for him and listening to his opinions and about Jewish music. I published an article in 2003 with Michael Steinlauf in the Polish Journal, which is largely about Hescheles. And thanks to Hescheles, he really helped to open my eyes to the vast gulf separating the klezmer music of Europe and the klezmer music that came to America, that survived in America. So the group that I formed, Fabrisa, with Stephen Greenman and Michael Alpert and others, was really based on this work that I did with Hescheles. So we were trying to, not that all the repertoire was Galician, but we were trying to recreate something of the European klezmer sound. And besides the difference in instrumentation, of course, this was a violin-led group rather than a clarinet-led group. And of course, I was playing the cymbal, which I'd done from the beginning, back in the 70s. I reintroduced this Jewish instrument into Jewish music. Nobody else was playing it since Moskowitz passed away in the 60s, I believe. But also we were trying to, first of all, most of the recording is not dance music. And it's a very important point. In America, klezmer music became dance music. Almost 98%. There was almost nothing left of the non-dance repertoire. In Europe, and this we know also thanks to Moshe Berengowski's research, half of his volume of his collection is what he calls music for listening. And most of it in the klezmer terminology were moralische nigunim. That's to say, melodies of a high moral character. And the moralische nigunim were what you heard for much of the wedding day. In fact, before and after the dancing. So this was a very rich development of music. And as I studied it structurally, I began to see a relationship with Nusach, with the music of prayer. that in fact the composer, obviously most Jews in the shtetls were very familiar with davening. They davened in most cases, and if they didn't, they grew up davening. So it was a let's say an allusion which a klezmer composer musician would make and would be understood. And this is part of my point, is the klezmer is a mediator, because obviously their whole wedding repertoire was both, the whole wedding as such was both a secular and a religious ceremony, as it is in many cultures. It has both qualities. Now, if you look at your little handout that I gave you, this is a very important point, that again, in the book I talk a lot about history, which I can't really do here, but we should understand that the klezmer profession is a very old, continuous profession. It begins in the 16th century in Prague. As we know, we see the word klezmer etched on tombstones in the Jewish cemetery. And then it's used in the rabbinic documents from Krakow, in the Kahal minutes from 1595. And once this neologism, that's to say coming from klezmer for instruments, once it takes on a new meaning as professional musician, it keeps this meaning in Yiddish everywhere for the next 400 years. There was no documented Jewish community in Eastern Europe that was not aware of the term klezmer, and it always had the same meaning. And as I understood, unfortunately, Bergovsky was not in a position to do much research in the social aspect of klezmer because of the conditions of Stalinist rule, where he had to project the klezmer as the good proletarian poor Jew, helping other poor proletarian Jews. When I read other sources, including Stuchevsky, Joachim Stuchevsky's book HaKlezmerim, where he interviewed klezmorim in Tel Aviv, and especially my work with Mr. Hescheles, who was, as a band leader, he had to know the status of all the other bands in Galicia. This was basic information for him. When we see the huge social difference between different groups, different klezmer ensembles, that there was a very high level of klezmer who played largely for the Gentile aristocracy and also for wealthier Jews and perhaps the larger Hasidic courts, and the lowest level of klezmer who was playing both for Jews and for Gentiles, peasants, not aristocrats, and various stages in between. When they came to America, usually all that was leveled. So, in fact, you had here in Philadelphia one of the highest status klezmorim in Eastern Europe, Mila Lemish. And I learned through my colleague Vasily Kiselica in Chisinau. He published an article a few years ago in Romania where he found documentation about Lemish when he was still in Moldova. This man was playing for the wealthiest aristocrats in Bessarabia. You couldn't have a ball in Bessarabia without hiring Lemish's band. He was on a very high level. We don't understand why he came here. Frankly, there are many stories, because usually a klezmer on that status did not go anywhere. He wasn't emigrating to America, not to Canada, not to Palestine, certainly not. Somehow Lemish came here. It's a mystery. And obviously he could not maintain the status he had in Moldova once he was here. The case of Naftali Brandwein, by the way, Mr. Hescheles knew the Brandweins well, because the Brandweins were the family of the klezmorim of Provišlan, which was a shtetl near his. He was from Glina, in the Lemberg, Lavova region. And as he was told me, the Brandweins were always on a higher level than his own papa. He says, even in our heyday, the Brandweins would have looked down on us. They had more of a tradition, and for various reasons in Provišlan. But Naftali, he seems to have been the black sheep of the family, that he probably could never have fit in with the standards of his family. And one of his brothers may have suggested, why don't you get a ticket and come to America, and clear out of here. We never know this. But Naftali came to New York, and to everybody's surprise, did very well, actually. So it's another kind of story. Dave Taras, my teacher, apparently also was from a rather high-level Kapelia in Podolian, Ukraine. He only left because of the Russian Civil War. If it weren't for that, I'm sure he wouldn't be going anywhere. And once he and his wife left Ukraine, they ended up in Bessarabia, which by that time was Romanian. And as he told me, he spent some time in Yedinets, because that was indeed a center of music. And he brought that repertoire, which he didn't know when he was growing up, because he wasn't from Bessarabia. He brought that repertoire to New York and really developed it very much, and to everybody's surprise, did very well with it in America. So, again, what we can learn from America is very spotty. So what happened to come here, what the immigrant society could support, and I also recommend James Leffler's master's thesis from Columbia University about, it's called The Search of a Respectable Wedding, which he published, I believe, in 2000. Not published, he wrote it in 2000. And this shows you how much the traditional Jewish wedding had declined drastically, very quickly after the immigrants came here. I was really surprised that even before the First World War, most of the customs of the wedding were dropped, which meant most of the music of the wedding was dropped. And that it helps to explain why so little of the more developed musical forms were documented in America. They're documented in Europe, except in a few manuscripts, one of which, by the way, is here in Philadelphia with the Hoffman family. You actually have some of the wedding repertoire documented. Now, another point that I think I should make is that, and this is Beregovsky's quotation you have here on your handout, as Beregovsky wrote, no specific wedding songs were sung at Jewish weddings, other than the verses of the Batchen. At times, one or two short verses were sung to the dance teams. Now, he states this. Now, I can't overemphasize how crucial this is. Every culture that I've ever studied in Europe, or Eastern Europe, or in the Middle East, have wedding songs. They're usually sung by women in most cultures, including the Sephardic culture. In Yiddish, we had no such thing. We had such things. In fact, my colleague Ludmila Sholachova at the UVO did a wonderful paper back in 2008 about the survivals of the earlier wedding songs, which were sung. They seem to be very old German songs, going back probably to the 16th century. They survive in modernized, so-called modernized forms in some 19th century sources, but they were not sung during the wedding. They were sung the week before the wedding. They were not sung by the family. They were sung by servants. A respectable Jewish man did not sing. Didn't sing Yiddish at all, and didn't sing wedding songs, certainly not. And a woman was not allowed to sing at a wedding. And when this law, this rule came, we have no paper trail about this. I talked to Moshe Rossman in Tel Aviv about this, that he doesn't really know when this happened. But by the early 19th century, it's clear that there was a long tradition of women not singing at weddings. I remember talking to Bela Gottesman in New York about this, because her mother, Livsha, was a great folk singer. And I asked her, did your mother ever sing at weddings? And Bela looked back at me and said, what? Her brothers would have killed her. Literally. It would have been honor killing if she had sung at a wedding. So that was the rule, that was the standard throughout the 19th and probably much of the 18th century. Hence, our klezmorim and the Batchen, the wedding orator, were able to monopolize the music at the wedding, totally. And that's one point, that the fact this gender differentiation is absolutely crucial, and the Ashkenazim carried this further than other Jewish groups. The differentiation of the musical world of the men and the musical world of the women. So that perhaps is something we're not very comfortable with today, but it did allow, let's say, the musicians to create a rich repertoire that would guide you through the whole wedding day. And Beregovsky emphasizes this, that at a Jewish wedding, you would know where you were just by listening to what kind of tune. And the Batchen, of course, would be singing various, either serious or jocular or even sometimes very nasty things to people at certain points. I mean, it was a wild card. And as I say here, that like his partner, the Batchen, the klezmer was both a subversive and a staple of the traditional Jewish society. That this is important, that the Ashkenaz culture allowed for these kind of figures who were absolutely necessary and absolutely kosher, but watch out. They could be really dangerous. And there are many descriptions of Batchonim who would say outrageous things. And it's in the literature, in the memoir literature, and even Heschel has told me a wonderful story about his local Batchan from Glina, who was at a wedding with a famous rabbi, Meir Shapiro. He's a very well-known rabbi. And he was saying such outrageous things that the rabbi slapped his face. And then the Batchan turned to him and said in Yiddish something like, well, zu sein a Schläger kann sein euch a Wasserträger. To be a bully, you can be a water carrier, which of course a water carrier was the lowest level of a Jewish man, to be a water carrier. So this was the exchange between the rabbi and the Batchan. These things happened at Jewish weddings. So the absence of the women, of course, is very crucial. The other point is that the klezmorim had the absolute right of chazukah, of monopoly, to perform at Jewish wedding. Nobody else could perform at a Jewish wedding, let alone Gentiles. Other Jews couldn't perform at a Jewish wedding. So to be a klezmer, it wasn't just that you were a Jewish musician, is you were a member of the guild. And you were a member of those families who had the right to perform at a Jewish wedding. Other Jewish musicians could perform at other kinds of venues, but not at a wedding. Now, in the book, I have a lot of history. Chapter 3 talks about the development of the Klezmer Guild and how various changes in the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire and so forth. So I think I have to leave history at that. Take a drink of water. I will say a word about gesture, and I think I should say a word about fusion as well. The fusion concept I got from Max Weinreich, who discusses the Yiddish language in terms of fusion. And he talks about stocks, determinants, and components, talking about the different languages from which words and phrases and grammar could be drawn to create Yiddish, and then what actually went into the language, and then the specific words that created the fusion. Not only words, but grammatical forms as well. The same could be said of English. English is also a fusion language. Yiddish is not unique in that respect. I found the concept useful for discussing the klezmer repertoire because after, again, I spent many years looking at all the available documentation musically, starting with Berezovsky's collection, which is several hundred melodies, and many other things. So I think probably by now I've looked at close to 1,000 melodies from Europe, of European origin. And what I see is that you have a fusion with what I see as basically 5 stocks that produce the determinants that can produce the components. And in the book, in my introduction, I talk about what those stocks are. And as I see it, what you have is one stock which is coming from Renaissance dance music, which you have also in other Northeast European music, such as Polish music, Ukrainian music, and Hungarian music. But where it appears in Jewish music, it's not borrowed from any of them. It's coming from the West in an Ashkenazic adaptation. I have a chapter which talks about nigun and zmiras, a rhythmic melody among the Ashkenazim, because the klezmer, the instrumental melodies, let's say, they are related. I don't want to phrase this in a way that's more. I'll say another way. Berezovsky had collected a very important anthology of nigunim, which he calls Jewish folk melodies without words. And in the introduction, which is in Russian, which has not yet been published in other languages than Russian, he explains that in fact there's a strong instrumental element in these vocal tunes. You can see this. So I took this seriously. Also, Judith Frigishin, my wife, who worked with the Musikash ensemble 20 years ago or so on this lost Jewish music of Transylvania, she finds the same thing, that in fact many of the vocal nigunim and religious songs are ultimately coming from instrumental music, but much older instrumental music. She thinks often 17th century as an origin. So what I find is that these miras and nigunim preserve a very old level of Western instrumental practice, among other things, which would not be so common in the instrumental repertoire anymore, in the klezmer repertoire. what we have in the klezmer repertoire is a bit of this older, maybe 16th century element, more of the 17th, 18th century, Baroque. And you find that in dance music and also in in wedding melodies. I'll play you one briefly. And this is very understandable considering that you have, among many other Baroque influences on Ashkenaz culture, you have the dance Scher, which I now know after doing research in German sources. Scher was the standard North German word in the 17th and 18th century for contra dance. And in the modern times, in the 19th and 20th century, only East European Jews preserved that word. The Germans no longer use it. We use it, Scher. And Scher was known as Scher everywhere in Eastern Europe. There was no community that wouldn't have known what a Scher is. They may not have danced it because the Hasidim may have forbidden it. But it was known. And indeed it was borrowed by non-Jews, both in Ukraine and in Moldova. So the Baroque connection is quite clear. Let me just, before I think if I count five, I should give you five elements and then give you examples, right? So that's 1, 2. 1 is Renaissance, 2 is Baroque. The third is Nusach, Ashkenaz liturgy, which you have first of all in the wedding repertoire, which again died out in America. So American Jews wouldn't know from this. I remember years ago when I was playing with Chavrisa in New York. This often happens to me after a concert. A great informant comes to me, gives me priceless information, and I'm too distracted at that point to get his name or her name. All I can remember is some things that he told me. But at one concert with Chavrisa in New York, an elderly gentleman from Philadelphia came up to me and said, you know, when I was a child, at weddings in Philadelphia, they played tunes like that. Right? So probably in the interwar period, there still were weddings that demanded this old world wedding repertoire, not only dance music. So, this is interesting. In that repertoire, you have many references, especially to the Shabbos, Shachris, liturgy, and other liturgical references, but they're very short and very artistically developed within the context of the particular klezmer genre. You have it also in the dance repertoire, especially the form called Chusidl. Now Chusidl, I think the longest chapter in my book is about Chusidl. Chusidl was an extremely important dance form in Eastern Europe. For Gentiles, that when they talk both in Ukraine and in Moldova, they wanted to characterize Jews dancing, Chusid. That's what the Jews do. They do Chusid. But they didn't mean Hasidic dance. Obviously, Hasidim don't call their dancing Chusid. It's like Misnagdim calling our dancing the Yidel. There was no such Yidel dance. Right? So Chusidl is an interface between Hasidic dancing and Misnagdic dancing, done by Misnagdim, by non-Hasidic Jews. And it died out very early in America. When my teacher, Taras, came here in 1925, he recorded some wonderful Chusidlach, very, very wonderful tunes. But after that, almost nothing. And the immigrant taste was very much against this interface of the religious and secular. It was antithetical, I think, to American society. Hank Isnetsky tells me that here in Philadelphia, in the interwar period, and especially after the Second World War, the Chusidl was called the dance for the old men. And if an old guy really asked for it, the klezmer would say, okay, play this dance for the old guy, play dance for the old man. So that's what it had become. What was dominant here was the Bulgar. And my article 4 years ago was about Bulgarish. But Bulgarish and Chusidl are, you might say, opposites, polar opposites. The Bulgar emphasizes youth, speed, agility, aggression. That's what Bulgar is about. Chusidl emphasizes dignity, age, seniority, gesture, expression, and it's an upper body dance. Bulgar is almost exclusively lower body. At the most, you can move your shoulders in Bulgar. My father would always insist that I had to move my shoulders when I was dancing Bulgar. But Chusidl, you do things with your feet, but it's mostly up here. Now, I'll get to gesture in a moment. The fourth stock that leads to the determinants and components is coming from Greco-Turkish music. both different social levels, both the popular dance music and the highest court music. There are many reasons for this, and we have to understand that the Ashkenazim were really between the Polish Empire and the Ottoman Empire for a very long time. And there we see in the music that the Ashkenazim were very much aware of Turkish music. Some of the few early manuscripts we have, such as the Aaron Bear manuscript from Berlin from 1791, shows that this guy, who was a chazan and a violinist, it seems, was aware of Ottoman court music. And he composed these very beautiful melodies which are a mixture of Turkish modes with Turkish long rhythmic periods, sometimes 28 measures, and Baroque melody, and certain bits of Ashkenazic Nusach in the same melody. Yes. And I gave a paper at the University of Athens some years ago where I compared a manuscript by a chazan from Dubno, northern Ukraine, the famous Weintraub, Hirsch Weintraub, who was also a very famous violinist, comparing it with a gypsy manuscript of exactly the same time from Moldova, from Yash. And they were both aware of the same Turkish modes. They treated the melodies differently, but you could see that the Turkish input was the same for the klezmer in Ukraine and for the gypsy in Moldova. And we also know now that klezmorim, one of the things they were known for, we have documents from descriptions from Poland and Bohemia from the 18th century of klezmorim dressing as Turks, dancing as Turks, and playing Turkish music for the Gentile aristocracy. So this is part of the deep history of klezmer music in Eastern Europe. Now, the fifth stock, in a sense, replaced much of the fourth stock. The fifth stock is the Moldavian, Wallachian, Romanian music, which became very dominant in the last third of the 19th century after the Turks left Moldova. After the Crimean War, well, not just the Turks, but the Greeks, because remember that Moldova was ruled by Greek aristocracy from Istanbul, called the Phanarios. And there were many klezmorim already in Moldova in the Greek period. So when the Greeks had to go back to Istanbul, the Romanian cities became increasingly Romanian-speaking. So before one had to know Greek or Turkish to get anywhere in the larger Moldavian cities. But after the last third of the 19th century, the Romanian language would be enough, and the gypsies there began to create a national music, which with also a lot of cooperation of klezmer musicians. That is what I call the transitional repertoire, which is what came to dominate American klezmer music. And in a sense, it replaced much of the fourth determinant coming from Turkish, and never completely though. Let's say this Greco-Turkish element remained in klezmer music, and in Moldova today, even some of their gypsy dance tunes that are clearly Greco-Turkish in origin, they call them Jewish. The gypsies say this is still Oriental, still Yevreyesk. This is the Jewish style, the Oriental style. So anyway, it's a complicated story. I deal with it a bit in the last chapter of the book. Not to forget gesture. So gesture is, I've come increasingly to see, crucial in defining how Jews express themselves. First, I go back to David Efron's classic study of speech gesture in the Yiddish language, which he did in Columbia University in the 1930s. It was published in 1942, Gesture, Race, and Culture, which is the locus classicus for gesture studies. It's referred to by linguists, first of all, studying gesture and language, and I find it's known increasingly by ethnomusicologists working in India, especially working in Spain, Spanish flamenco, that this study of speech gesture in Yiddish is one of the landmarks in trying to see the evolution of language, actually its connection to the body. And in Abu Dhabi, by the way, for 3 years, I was teaching a course called Gesture. Why? Largely because I had a student body that didn't have that much musical training, but they came largely from Asia and Africa. And in their languages, they usually had a great deal of gesture. So I found that I could, although we were speaking English at the university, But I found that much more than when I spoke with North Americans, when I spoke with Ethiopians or Indians or Emiratis or Iranians, they understood exactly what I was talking about. That you can't express yourself without moving your body. In fact, it's not a complete expression if you don't move your whole body, and that they understand that music, of course, has much of that quality, and there's almost a conflict between the kind of musical expression which is dominated by a motor rhythm, and the kind which allows the gesture to override the rhythm. The gesture comes first, the rhythm comes afterwards. Okay? So let me give you, in Jewish music, I have a couple of minutes, an example of what I mean. It's in my group, Chavrisa, but I worked on this tune with Mr. Hescheles, our teacher from Galicia. It's using a rhythm that's dum, 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 which comes from the Moldavian hora, but no Moldavian would ever want to dance to this. This was one of the wedding tunes, not a dance tune. It was called Mazel Tov. I think this melody should make my point in several levels. The melody, by the way, is modulating in a very traditional Jewish way from a minor-like mode into Phrygisch. We'll go into a major-like mode afterwards. From the very first section, the tune announces itself as a Jewish melody. Why? It's stopping on the minor third degree of the scale for the first repetition, and then on the fourth for the second. And there's no movement when it hits the climax of the melody is hitting the third, hitting the fourth. So you have da dam da 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 dee da 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 dam da. That is the emotional climax of that phrase. It's the end of the phrase. It's motionless. It's a held note on the third degree, and then repetition. Da 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 dam da 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 dam da 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 on the fourth, and then the Jewish cadence. Da 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 da. Now, even though this is using the rhythm of the Moldavian hora, no Moldavian tune would be created this way. There's no way that you'd have a motionless stasis on the third degree, and then a stasis on the fourth degree. That's not how any kind of European dance tunes are created. But this is not a dance tune. And then the phrasing, which Mr. Hescheles was hitting me over the head with this very, very often, he would always tell me, don't keep going, stop, make phrases. The melody has to talk. Give it a chance. Don't cover it over with the rhythm.
So let's say the mindless way of playing this would be dum da 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 dum da dee da dum dum da da dum dee dum dum da da dum. Now, perhaps the younger musicians playing for the poorest Jewish weddings might play this way. But if you want to be taken seriously as a klezmer, no. You have to make sentences. You have to have utterances. There has to be a statement. Right? That's essential. Which is why he couldn't tolerate klezmer music in America. In fact, he was asked to play in a well-known klezmer ensemble in New York. He refused. Because he said, they've lost that. They're not making sentences anymore. For him, it's not interesting. Okay, so that's, you probably don't have much more time. I should dance. Okay. Quiet, Feldman. Okay, I'll do a little bit of how one dances to, okay, this is a tune that I was talking to Ben about this. It's a tune collected by Beregovsky, from a bass player. He calls it Freilachs, but it's a very high-level Freilachs. Now, in general, the klezmorim, this I learned also from Taras, tunes had different values. You couldn't play the same tune for the rich and the poor and the middle class. Tunes had different values. So the higher level of Freilach was often called skochne, which is a Czech word. It's probably a very old word in the klezmer vocabulary. And it meant a more developed melody that had more things going on, more modulations, and more dialogue. So in this tune, which you heard when I started the talk, before the talk started, the first section has three melodies just in the first section. And they're communicating with each other. So the melody begins, it's the first melody. Then so we're modulating now into a liturgical pentatonic scale. Da da dee da, and another modulation, da da dee da 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 da, which may develop into a major, but it won't. Bum bum da 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 da, closing in minor, da 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 dee da 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 da, da da dee da 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 da. Okay? This is a serious Jewish melody. This tune is talking. It's actually saying something, and it's only in the first section. It goes elsewhere. So let me just show you one way you might embody this. And this is a point also I learned from Taras. Every decent Jewish melody can be expressed physically. And a good klezmer should know how to use his body to express the melody. If he can't dance it properly, he can't play it properly. And Taras himself was a great dancer. Even when I knew him in his 70s, beautiful dancer. So this is, let's play this tune again. This is, by the way, Christian David, wonderful German clarinetist, and Sanne Moritzka, a Dutch, his wife, a Dutch accordion player. Yeah. Okay.
Wonderful.